policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time in this first hour talking about the millennial generation. I think it's apropos. We certainly have focused a lot of time and attention on that here on Point of View. Even today, our good friend Eric Metaxas has a piece out in Breakpoint on good news about millennials, and we're going to be talking about this book, Cultural Captives, The Beliefs and Behavior of American Young Adults. But more importantly, also at the end, talking about some solutions, because certainly we'll hear some things that might be somewhat discouraging, but at the same time, we certainly want to encourage you to find out more about what you can do, even in your own church and in your own community, especially in your own family, to stem some of the trend that we'll be talking about today. In studio with me is Steve Cable. He's Senior Vice President of Probe Ministries. By the way, if you would like to watch the broadcast, you can go to our livecast today at our website, pointofview.net. He has both a bachelor's degree and master's degree from Rice University, spent 30 years in the telecom industry and the competitive high-tech world at that time, and then has now come back and works with us at Probe Ministries. He is a member of Prairie Creek Baptist Church and is the author of this book, Cultural Captives. Steve, great to have you on the program with us today.
Thank you, Kerby. I'm glad to be here.
One of the things we're going to start right off talking about are all these surveys, and whether it's Eric Metaxas or whether it's other people that have been writing in Christianity Today, you know, we see all these surveys, you know, the General Social Survey, the GSS survey, the National Study of Youth, Baylor had a study, of course, lots of Barna surveys. Even Eric Metaxas talks about the Pew survey. And I think people, Steve, get very confused. And I think the one thing that is so valuable about your book, and there are many, but one of the first ones in this 200-page book, is you look at all these surveys, pull them together, and what you found is that a lot of people tend to think that these surveys are inconsistent. But actually, as you looked at those facts and figures and statistical questions, you found that most of the surveys were saying the same kind of thing.
Absolutely. What we found when we looked at the surveys in detail was that all the surveys were consistent with one another, whether it was the General Social Services survey or the Barna survey, which have been written in different books as being very different from one another.
Yes.
When we looked at the actual survey data, they were very consistent with one another.
And I think it might be well to point out that there have been a lot of people that have picked out maybe one statistic and say, oh, no, the millennial generation is really doing quite well. But if you look at it over the entire range of questions, some of the concerns that certainly I've raised, we've had John Dickerson on this program, and other people have raised, I think are really borne out by some of the statistical evaluation that you've done.
Right. When we take some of the surveys that were used to say everything's fine, we're doing great, and we ask those surveys the same questions that Barna was asking of the Barna surveys, we came out with a very similar picture that said, no, things are not quite as good as they might look on the surface, that as most people would suspect when they look at the culture around them and see where things are going, there are definitely cracks in the belief systems of most people, and particularly of our young adults.
One of the things we're going to spend some time talking about are some of the discouraging aspects. But again, we're going to talk about something that is a great program I think you could put in your own church as a solution for that. But at the same time, I'll add the disclaimer, because I mentioned Eric Metaxas talks about the good news about millennials. He talks about individuals that have been outstanding. And even around this roundtable, some of our own children are good examples of that. So when we talk about the discouraging numbers, we have to recognize there are some very outstanding exceptions to that. True?
Absolutely. That's definitely true. And as you say, our children seem to be walking the right way, have the right attitude, the right knowledge of Scripture. And there are many others that fall into that pattern. What we're looking at and discussing today is, well, what the majority of emerging adults or young adults are drifting or clinging to the culture rather than clinging to Christ. So.
You know, this book, Cultural Captives, is one I would certainly recommend to anybody that's in church leadership, especially. Some incredible endorsements from people like Dr. Richard Land, Josh McDowell, and others. And one of the things that's so helpful is because you've looked at all these surveys, it's all included in the book. And then if you're a really busy pastor, church leader, you've got a couple of pages that are sort of the executive summary. And one of the things you talk about here is we are seeing a decline in the church. And that is when we look at even born-again Protestant denominations, that seems to be declining. Then we also see that Catholics seem to be sort of holding steady, but there's sort of a reason for that. And then, of course, the mainline Protestant churches, we've seen them declining for some time. So take us through that real quickly if you can.
Okay. Well, first thing, let's talk about the increase in those young adults who don't believe or don't affiliate with the Christian church at all.
Yeah, the atheist, agnostic, no belief.
Right.
And
nuns, some of them have some Christian beliefs, but they're not associated with the church. And that has grown dramatically by almost 200% from 1990 to today. From about 12 to 14% of young adults in 1990 to almost 40%
That's amazing.
of young adults today who say, I'm not affiliated with any Christian religion, Catholic, Protestant, whatever.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that led Probe to really get in and start looking at this, was that dramatic change, because it was fairly constant from 1970 through 1990, and then in 1995 it started to grow, and it's been growing consistently ever since. So we're expecting when the 2014 surveys come out that we'll have over 40% of young adults in America who fall into that category, not affiliated with any Christian religion.
Well, so rise of what I call the nuns, none of the above. I'm not going to any church at all. Let's, if we can, then talk about what about certainly the mainline Protestant. That's easy one, because I think everybody's seen that if you really don't hold to a biblical view, after a while, a lot of people say, why should I bother to go to church in the first place?
Well, the mainline Protestants are very interesting because attendance or affiliation with mainline Protestant among young adults has decreased by 52% over that period.
Yeah.
So roughly they're half of what they were. However, as Christian Smith pointed out in his book, Souls in Transition, in interviewing these young adults, he came to the conclusion that the mainline Protestant view has won the day amongst all young adults.
Yeah.
But the thing is that if you take the mainline Protestant view, then everything you need to know you learned in kindergarten, and there's no need for church.
Yeah.
And so even though their viewpoint has won the day, their attendance has declined dramatically because there's no need for church.
Wow. And then one more, the born-again Protestants, that has declined, even though in that case you would hope that they would be holding steady, but there's been a bit of a decrease, hasn't there?
There has been. It was about 28% in 1995, and it's now down to 22%, which looks like a small decrease, but it's actually about a quarter of what it was. 20% of what it was decreased.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to also spend some time talking about this particular survey, probably one of the largest, if not the largest survey ever done of born-again millennials, done by Probe Ministries with the help of Barna Research Group. And I think you would like to hear some of those facts and figures in terms of what they believe and certainly how they practice their Christian faith. Then we're going to talk about, as we move from not only this book, Cultural Captives, but to this idea of once captive, to really begin to talk about what your church can do. And when we come back, we'll give you a little better definition of captivity, since we'll be talking about the idea of captivity, and that is certainly based upon Colossians 2:8, but we'll talk about that with Steve Cable, and a little bit later take some phone calls. All that coming up right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
You know, this coming election and future elections will be influenced by the millennials who view the world differently than previous generations. A higher percentage of them have college degrees than previous generations, and because of that, they are carrying heavier college loan debt than previous generations. They're also living with their parents in higher numbers because they're often struggling to find good jobs. Now, if you knew just these few facts, you might conclude that they would favor a free market over greater governmental intervention in the economy. Less government regulation and a freer market would translate into more jobs in the private sector. That is the conclusion you might also draw from the recent headlines touting a Reason Group survey of millennials. A typical headline concludes 64% of millennials favor a free market over a government-controlled economy. But if you look a little closer, you won't find as much support for capitalism. By a narrow margin, 52% favor capitalism and 42% choose socialism. The problem appears to be a lack of education about basic economic philosophies. A CBS New York Times poll from a number of years ago discovered that Americans in general had a difficult time defining the word socialism. And of all the groups surveyed, only 16% of the millennials could define socialism as a government ownership or some variation. To put that in perspective, 57% of people who self-identified themselves as part of the Tea Party gave an adequate definition of socialism. Millennials are also divided in whether free markets promote economic growth and development. Only a third believe that a free market is the most effective way in promoting economic opportunity. So educating millennials about economic philosophies is going to be key in this and future elections. If they don't know what socialism is and they don't know the benefits of a free market, they're unlikely to vote for candidates that will improve the economy, which will give them better jobs. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk about the millennial generation today, and in particular this new book, Cultural Captives, The Beliefs and Behavior of American Adults. And we would certainly want to encourage you to find out more about the book. There are a couple ways in which you can do so. First of all, I have the first article is written by Steve Cable called Examining Our Cultural Captivity. Then if you go to our web links, the first web link is to Probe Ministries. You can go to probe.org. You will see in the upper right-hand corner his book, Cultural Captives, if you would like to get a copy. Then you will see Once Captive, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute, but that is the solution. And really, that's where we want to lead ultimately, Steve. We can talk about some of the bad news, but we have a listener base of a lot of activists, and I'm encouraging people today to do something about this. There is a tendency when you hear some of this to simply want to go off in a corner, get in the fetal position, find a bomb shelter, get away from life. But we are dedicated to the fact that we can turn this around, and we've got a program we'll talk about in just a few minutes that I think will.
Right. I mean, the message of Christ is changing lives today, just around the world, just as it has for the last 2,000 years. So we don't have to be ashamed of that or back away from it. But we need to be aware of what's going on and present the gospel in a way that communicates to the generation that we're communicating with.
Let's talk about this idea of cultural captivity, because it's key to your book and it's also key to the survey that Probe Ministries did with Barna Group. And it is based on Colossians 2:8, the idea that we should not be taken captive by our culture. But explain what you mean by cultural captivity.
Well, cultural captivity is when a Christian believer is agreeing with what the culture says about different topics, whether it's topics directly related to the gospel or topics that are related to our actions as Christians, and they are choosing to align themselves with what the culture says is okay, what the culture says, the way we should act, the way we should respond, rather than the example of Jesus Christ.
Sure. And so the survey that you commissioned and we commissioned through the Barna Group was one to look at born-again evangelical young adults, 18 to 40. Talk about first how you define the born-again idea, because only those who were born again took the survey, true?
That's correct. And as you know, when Barna does a survey, they ask two questions for the born again. Mm-hmm. One is, have you had an experience with Jesus Christ that's still important in your life today? And do you know you're going to heaven when you die because you put your faith in Christ, not because of your good works? And so those that answer yes to both those questions, we then categorize as born again, and then that's the people that we surveyed to learn more about not only what they believed, but why they believe what they believe, where their beliefs came from.
And then you went and began to ask them a series of questions, and on the basis of those questions, again, George Barna uses 6 criteria to determine whether you have a Christian worldview. And these are pretty basic questions about God and Jesus and Satan, absolute value, absolute belief, and those kinds of things. So then you found, after all of that, of the born-agains, how many fit into that category of those who had a consistent Christian worldview?
Right. For those under the age of 30, it was about 28% that had a biblical worldview, a consistent Christian worldview, using those 6 questions. And we were able to then look at these different groups and see that about 60% of them, of all born-again young adults, attended church on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. But less than half of them had a biblical worldview, which is one of the things that led us to develop the Once Captive program, because we have a large audience of people that are going to church that are really not grounded in the truths of Scripture.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that Once Captive program in just a minute, but let's carry it on. Okay, so we already go from 100% of born-agains down to what you said, basically 28% that have a Christian worldview. And so some people might say, well, at least we're better than we thought we were. You know, at least more than 1 out of 4, basically, have a biblical worldview. But then you started following those individuals that have a biblical worldview and begin to ask, do they have a worldview that combines with basic biblical practices and things of that nature? What did you find then?
Right. And so when we ask some basic biblical practice questions, do you read the Bible once a week? How often do you go to church? Do you pray on a daily basis? And when we look at those type of just basic, simple biblical practices, we found that about 14% of the born-again Christians of this age group had a biblical worldview and a basic, minimal biblical practice, which means that 85% of them do not.
Yeah. For those of you that are listening, you might get out a pen and just write down 100%, and then write 28%, and then now 14%. And I'm going to ask one more question. Okay, when you watch those then, how many of them then apply that to their life? Because it's one thing to think biblically. What about those who actually apply those to their life choices? What did you find then?
Right. So then we asked them questions about, well, what do you believe about abortion, sex outside of marriage, science, and faith? Now, I want to be clear. We didn't ask, have you ever sinned in those areas? Sure, you can be a devout Christian and fall into sin in these areas. We ask them, do you believe these are okay? Do you align with the culture or with Christ? And when we look at those, the percentage that have a biblical worldview, a minimal biblical practice, and have a basic set of beliefs on cultural practices, it was 2%.
2%.
So 98% of them do not.
So again, 100%, and then we go down to 28%, then we go down to 14%, and finally down to 2%. And again, that's kind of the good news that people sometimes talk about, because we do know some of those 2%ers. But this leads me to a comment I've made on this program before, and you've heard me make it in front of audiences before. If it is that 2%, and those are the people we're depending upon for leadership in the future, I would suggest that unless we turn that around, and we believe that there are ways to do that, the churches that we are experiencing right now, the churches we attend, the churches that we give money towards may not exist 20 years from now. The Christian ministries that we support and appreciate may not exist 20 years from now. And maybe even the missionaries that we've supported and the mission agencies may not exist. And if any of those do, they may not have the vitality they do right now. And so for people that oftentimes, Steve, say, well, every generation we think is a lost generation. Everybody's convinced that this generation is lost. This is different. I mean, statistically, it's different than anything we've seen before.
Absolutely. Obviously, in every generation, there is a dip in the college years that comes back up. But what we've seen here is a significant divergence from that prior statistic, that prior condition where people would kind of fall away in the college years and then come back. And what we're seeing here is that these young adults are falling away in much larger numbers and are not, we don't have an indication yet that they're coming back. It's our hope and our plan. What we're trying to do with Once Captive is to provide the information they need to come back.
And we'll talk about that after the break. But just before we go to the break, there are all sorts of really great insights in your book that most everyone else has never written about because you've looked at the numbers. And one of those gets back to your comment about college. You know, it used to be that parents were fearful about sending their kids to college. They still are. I mean, that's why Probe Ministries has Mind Games. That's why there's Summit Ministries. That's why there's Worldview Academy. These organizations really preparing kids for their college experience. And I remember when I joined Probe Ministries 38 years ago, boy, I feel old, we had a brochure that said, when your kids go off to college, will they lose their faith? And so we recognized that sending your kid off to college was toxic to their faith. But what you found is that sometimes those who don't go off to college in a slightly higher percentage lose their faith than the ones that go off to college. That was an interesting anomaly that you discovered.
That's right. That's a new statistic of just in this century. In the last century, it was definitely the case that those who went off to college were more likely to abandon their faith than those who did not. But since in this century, that's not the case. First of all, both of them are much more likely not to maintain their faith.
Right.
But those who don't go to college are slightly more likely than those who do to walk away from their faith. And, we didn't survey them on this question, but we're pretty confident the reason for that is that you don't have to go to college now to have your faith bombarded.
Yeah.
You just watch television, go to the internet, go to school, your faith is going to be attacked.
Well, one way that you've put it, and I've put it that way as well, it used to be in the 1970s and 80s and even part of the 90s that the university was toxic to your faith, still is, but now the culture is toxic to your faith. There is a quote that's been attributed to Abraham Lincoln. I don't know if he ever said it, but it's been attributed to him time and time again. The philosophy of the classroom in one generation becomes the philosophy of the government in the next. Put a different way, the philosophy or the toxicity of the classroom in one generation has led to the toxicity of the culture in the next. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about solutions. So step away from the ledge. You don't need to jump off yet, and you don't need to go buy land in Montana, get in the fetal position, because we're convinced that there are some ways to turn this around. We're going to talk about this Once Captive program, and if you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the conversation we're having today, first of all, we have the article by Steve Cable, Examining Our Cultural Captivity. Then under the web links, you have one to Probe Ministries. As you go there, you can find out about the book and order it, and I would highly recommend it to those of you that are in church leadership to understand what is happening in our culture. But then underneath it is a button that says Once Captive, and that is something we're going to be talking about in the next half hour. And, of course, along the way, give you a chance to join our conversation. Steve Cable in studio with me. We'll be back with more right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221, or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today about the millennial generation. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Stephen Cable with us today as we talk about his book, Cultural Captives. And I want to give you a couple of action items here. I know many of you would like to do something about this, and there are some things you can do. First of all, it's very important to educate yourself about this issue. And so we have a link to Probe Ministries, probe.org, and you will see that there's a way in which you could order the book. It's very inexpensive, Cultural Captives. And it is one that in 200 pages summarizes all these different surveys, including the one we just talked about, the one that Probe Ministries did with the Barna Group. It also brings all sorts of scripture and other things to bear. And so one action item, obviously, is to educate yourself about this issue. Number two, Steve, let's talk about the fact that they can actually do an assessment of their own church. And so I'm talking right now to pastors, to Sunday school Bible fellowship leaders. There is a way that your church could sign up and do this survey. And this survey is really, in a sense, one that was developed out of the questions that you ask and the answers you received from the Barna survey. So talk about that assessment for just a minute.
Right. We prepared this assessment to allow churches to look at their own state of health. What do their members and attenders really believe? And we based it upon the survey that we did with Barna, but tailored it to an assessment tool as opposed to a survey tool. And we've had several churches take the survey, and it's been very eye-opening to the senior staff of those churches as they see, well, maybe our church, particularly our young adults, are not quite as taking in everything we're teaching as we thought. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes pastors sit there and they look out in the congregation, they think everyone out there is agreeing with everything they say. Well, I want to inform you that what we found is that there are a lot of people out there, especially young adults, who, generally are in agreement with you, but there's several points where they just say, well, that's for him, he's an old fogey, and this is what we believe.
And I think it's important to think about how churches sort of fall down in that area. I remember last time I had George Barna in studio, he said, it is amazing to me because churches measure everything. You ask any pastor, how many people were in Sunday school, how many people were in the worship service, how much did we bring in terms of the offering? They can tell you those numbers. You ask them, how are we doing spiritually? And they kind of like, well, I don't know. I mean, I think we're doing pretty well, but we really don't know. And this assessment survey is something that you're providing, and I think will also be eye-opening to a lot of churches and maybe cause them to say, maybe we should consider this Once Captive program, integrated church experience that you've done, because, we have more of a need than I thought we might have had.
That's right. I mean, the churches that have taken it are good churches. But when we analyze their data the same way we analyze the data in the book, they come out fairly similar to the results that we have in the book, which is an eye-opening to most of them.
Now, again, as they go to probe.org, they can find it, or probably simpler, oncecaptive.com. Is that a good place to go?
Yes, they can go there and they can sign up, and we can contact them and work with their church to set this up.
Might also mention, for those of you that are on Twitter, a couple of things you might mention. There is a Once Captive Twitter post that is coming out on a regular basis at Once Captive. You've got a new one here. It's hashtag you may be culturally captive if. You may be culturally captive if. And so there's just a number of ways that you can connect up through social media. There's a Facebook page. Of course, there is the oncecaptive.com website. And that, I think, brings us to this whole issue of doing this inside the churches. And in your book, you talk about the fact that you also, with the Barna survey, ask what were the primary influencers to the young adults. And one of the things that you found, and it shouldn't surprise us, is that parents and grandparents are still very important. Hate to admit it, those of you that are youth pastors out there, parents still much more important to these young people than you are. And so it's important to recognize how important parents are, but also recognize these 18 to 40-year-olds that you did the survey of, they're the future parents. And if they don't have good theology, they're going to pass that bad theology on to the next generation. It could get even worse.
Right. I mean, at Probe, we are big supporters of reaching out to teenagers and helping teenagers come to grips with some of the issues that you deal with in today's culture. But one of the things that the work we've done on Once Captive has taught us is that it's that age from 18 to 25, particularly, when they process and their brains form up and they begin to develop their final views or strong views about these religious topics. And if we're not addressing them in that age group, we're not preparing them, then they're going to be the parents of the next generation, and they're not going to be setting an example for their children which is something that builds on itself from generation to generation.
Let's talk about the Once Captive program. It's available for churches. It's a package which involves a number of things. It involves, obviously, sermons. There are 7 sermons that a pastor can give. We have suggested ones there. There are daily readings from a book that I've written called Once Captive. So there's 7 weeks and 7 days in the week. So there's 49 chapters, and they're short chapters, more like a devotional. You then also, of course, have the music by an individual that was an award-winning artist that put together the music that goes with it that can be used by the worship service. Then, of course, you have small groups, and you have videos for the small groups. You have videos for the sermons. You have daily readings. You have emails, phone calls. It's a total integrated package, is it not?
That's right. We believe very strongly that, first of all, when you're dealing with something in a small group, it tends to have more impact on you than something you do by yourself.
Right. Because
you're getting together and you have a chance to discuss it and talk about it. But in today's world, we also have the opportunity to interact with you on a daily basis, not only through Kerby's book, but through voicemail, email, to bring to mind the things we're talking about, the things you're learning, to help it really get down into your soul.
Yeah, and it seems to me that one of the aspects of this is the integrated package, that it all comes together. I've sometimes, Steve, said to individuals how important this is by saying, what did your pastor preach on Sunday? Long pause, and they have to think, and maybe some of them can come up with it. But imagine if the pastor is preaching on it Sunday, and then Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, you're reading things out of my book that are related back to the sermon. You're also receiving either an email or a phone, a voicemail. You also maybe are in a small group where you're going and watching some of the videos and reinforcing that. I think it would do a lot more, and that's why we think that this 7-week integrated experience is going to be much more effective than some of the ways in the past that the church has tried to address this issue of cultural captivity.
That's right, and this package is put together with an understanding of how people really learn, how people are really impacted by the Word.
And so certainly one of the things we want to talk about is how you can get involved. We, again, have some of that information. And I thought it was interesting. We've done this in a couple of beta churches, one in the state of Texas. And I remember this one wife saying, about her husband, they're just chock full of scriptures. He's reading scripture every day, because you have some of the scripture that has already been preached on. But then again, you have a chance to get into it a little deeper, some of the writing that I've done. And so just imagine an entire congregation all on the same page, all going in the same direction. And as you point out, even in the surveys you've done, about half of the millennials have a biblical worldview. About half of them in a typical church do not. And so there's an opportunity to bring everybody together and to maybe identify some of those things that surfaced in your survey that actually need further addressing from the pulpit and then from some of the ongoing church experience.
Right, an important thing, it gives an opportunity for the church members, and particularly the young adults, to discuss their beliefs and their concerns with others. And so that gives you an opportunity to find out what people really believe, and to apply a Christian worldview perspective to it. Because we firmly believe at Probe that when you consider the alternatives, you find that the Christian worldview is the one that really holds together, the one that's consistent, the one that will take you through life.
We're going to take a break, and I'm going to take some of these phone calls. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But, Steve, as they go to Once Captive and they say, okay, I'd kind of like to see this. I'd like to see maybe a sample video. I'd like to see what it looks like. Maybe could I get a copy of the book, because you have a book on cultural captives, which talks about the problem. Then you have the Once Captive book, which is the solution. So as they go there, they can find more information?
Right. If they go to oncecaptive.com, there are sample videos that they can look at that will give them a feel for the type of material that we use. They can order the books. And certainly we'd love for you to contact us to look for doing the program for your church or your small group.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll take some of your phone calls. Perhaps you have some suggestions or even questions about what you can do to address this issue of cultural captivity. And, of course, we recognize that this is not just an American problem. We've talked about before that cultural captivity looks different in Asia or in Africa than it does in America. And so we recognize that some of these are timeless truths. Others need to be rooted into some of the cultural issues. So this is not just an American issue, but it is certainly one that we believe needs to be addressed, and it is under the theme of Colossians 2:8, that we should not be taken captive by the culture. Instead, we should have our minds renewed by Jesus Christ. And we're going to talk more about what that means and also take some of your phone calls right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In studio with us for a few more minutes, Steve Cable, as we talk about his book, Cultural Captives, The Beliefs and Behavior of American Young Adults. 1-800-351-1212. Let's take a phone call or two as we wind down this hour, and we'll go first to the state of California. Caesar, thank you for calling today. You're on with Steve Cable.
Oh, thank you, and thank you so much for doing this program. It is phenomenal. I think you're touching on a very core problem that we're facing in the church. I am a pastor here in California, and as you realize, I have to face incredible cultural battles every day.
Yes.
The things that I've been doing is to try to teach the congregation that really we are called to be disciples of Jesus, not just hearers of the word. And I've noticed that as I began to teach people how to do devotions on a daily basis so that they begin to glean on the scriptures
Good for you.
and apply them to their lives on a daily basis, I think I begin to see transformation in their lives. It is important that we go back to an obedience-based system in the church as opposed to knowledge-based, because what we have had so far is a lot of knowledge. So we have taken the Great Commission and we have made it sound like this: teach all that Jesus taught. So we've been teaching all that Jesus taught, but that's not what the Scripture says. The Scripture says, teach them to obey.
Yeah, make disciples. That's right. That's right.
And that's a huge difference. When you move from a system that is based on information, and since we are living in a day of information overload because of the Internet, so people have access to incredible resources at their fingertips. But it is not what they know the problem. It's that they are not living it out.
Very well said.
And I learned this, say, from my professors. We only value what we do, and we only do what we value.
Sure.
So I think that's I commend you for doing this, and I think that we need to go back to the simplicity of obeying the gospel, and the only way that we can do that is if we have some accountability. So we have some accountability systems in the church that will hold us accountable to, in small groups, to live out the truth of the gospel. Otherwise, we cannot make disciples just on Sundays with sermons. We have to be sharing life together.
Sure. Wonderful. And in some respects, he set up exactly why we have developed this integrated program, because it's easy to sit in church and listen and walk away. But 7 weeks, 49 messages get you back into the scriptures, as well as small group and accountability. Those are some of the elements of this Once Captive program. True? That's
right. And one of the main focuses that we're getting across in this material is your perspective on what it means to be a Christian. As a Christian, you're a citizen of heaven, living in eternity, temporarily assigned to this earth. And yet, so many young believers look at it as, oh, Jesus Christ is my insurance policy, and hopefully it'll work out that I'll get to go to heaven when I die. In the meantime, I'm just living this life.
Yeah.
Well, that's not what the Bible teaches us. We have a purpose to proclaim Jesus Christ, to live for Him. And we're already citizens of heaven.
Let's talk about what is actually in the Once Captive book. And since I wrote it, I can probably go through it pretty quickly. But, the first 7 chapters are based upon a sermon that the pastor would give on the idea of eternity and living for eternity, which you just mentioned. Then the next 7 chapters, and that would be the next pastor's message, which be on the deception, deceived by the father of lies, because we're in a spiritual battle. And we're taking casualties because some people don't realize it's a spiritual battle. Then we have a whole section on exposing false views, which we talked about, and then a whole section on exposing false living. And Cesar was just talking about that. We have a lot of people with head knowledge, but not maybe heart knowledge. We have a lot of people that maybe sort of know what's right, but then when it comes down to applying, and remember those numbers we talked about, it went from 100% to 28%, to 14% to 2%. When it came down to actually applying biblical ideas, there's that drop-off. Then chapters on embracing true reality. Then another 7 chapters on renewing your mind in the truth, which gets into a little bit of apologetics. And then finally, our true purpose in life. And I'm convinced, now that we've done this with some beta churches, and I'd love to have Cesar and some of his friends do that. I was just talking today with a Hispanic individual who was going to have a number of people that she knew in the Valley and other places maybe implement that in the Hispanic churches there. But whether it's Hispanic churches or black churches or white churches or Asian churches, whatever it might be, we certainly have found with these beta tests that this does bring about the kind of change that is necessary, so we don't have the next generation that is captive to the culture.
That's right. And one of the things we've found is that it's really necessary to have the combination of the small group and the studies, because in the small group, that's when it comes out and you get to talk about it, and it really takes root in your heart and mind when you've had a chance to talk about it with your peers.
Let's take at least one more phone call. We don't have a lot of time here, but we'll go to South Carolina, WLPG. Nancy, thank you for calling today.
Kerby, thank you so much for having me. I wanted to ask about, in doing this study, it really sparked my mind as I was listening to you talk that I have 3 teenage daughters who are very involved in our church, and we have homeschooled and raised them to be solid in their faith, and they are blown away at how many of their peers who have also been raised in Christian homes have become so comfortable with immorality simply because they hear about it so much. You know, it's out there, and I'm just wondering, is there a way that we can communicate to this culture that, you know what, if you really stopped and considered what this actually is, maybe deep in your heart you know that's immoral, but you're kind of standing for it because you hear it so much and because we're just completely consumed with it in our culture that you've just kind of become comfortable with it.
Yeah, you've got it right on target. First of all, in your book, Cultural Captives, you've identified certainly this disconnect between I'm praising the Lord in church, but I'm not that concerned about sexual immorality. I'm convinced that the Bible is true, but I really have kind of a non-biblical view about, say, homosexuality.
Right. Or one good example is a youth pastor in Texas who shared with me that he asked his youth in his youth group, he wanted to talk to them about cheating, and said, well, how many of you cheat in school? 100% of them raised their hands. They said, well, of course we cheat in school. That's how we get into a good college. We must cheat. Well, that's occurring in the church, and it's being affirmed by their fellow youth. Yeah. And so that's where we have to come in and start giving them that eternal perspective and saying, look, we have a different standard, and it's a standard that's going to last for eternity.
Well, and one of the things that the Once Captive program tries to do is get a situation where there's sort of an aha moment, right? And that
Absolutely.
is a point at where, I've been living my life, I've been sort of really living off the fumes of my parents' religious commitment, but I've never really embraced it myself, or I've been really living a divided life where on one hand at church I'm real spiritual, but the rest of my life I just live pretty much like the world. And so there's really a goal there to create kind of that aha moment to bring some conviction and hopefully some change. So Nancy, you are right on target. That is exactly why we developed something like this, which we think is going to have really a very great impact.
And one of the key objectives of the Once Captive is not just to impact those that are attending church, but to impact them in such a way that they begin to live out for Christ in their workplace, in their recreation places, and they begin touching the lives of those who need to know Christ.
Well, we're just about out of time. We'll do this again. I'm sure we'll come back and talk a little bit more about some of the ways in which we can turn this around. But we wanted you to be aware, first of all, of this new book, Cultural Captives, The Beliefs and Behavior of American Young Adults. But more importantly, rather than leave you depressed, I want to talk about a very important program that we've also developed. And you can find out more by going to oncecaptive.com. Those of you on Twitter can go at @OnceCaptive. And, of course, we also have that hashtag, you may be culturally captive if. And so there's a lot of fun things happening there. Lots of Twitter posts, a number of videos that you can watch. So, again, Steve, we encourage people to go to oncecaptive.com, watch those videos. This is something that you think you would want to have for your small group. This is something you would want to have maybe for your church. Certainly that is available on the website. And as I'm coming to a close, let me just mention that we've written about this, and we also, of course, have the survey, the assessment survey. I meant to mention that a minute ago, are some other ways in which you can be involved. We also have a very helpful article here that is available through our Outlook magazine, Reaching the Next Generation, and that's something that you can make available to your congregation. Contact us if you'd like to know more. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after these important messages.
Across the nation, this is Point of View. For materials offered during the broadcast, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, we'll open up the phones in just a few minutes. But in that first hour, if you were with us, we talked about the millennial generation. And again, we do commend to you some of the material and resources that we've talked about, including the book Cultural Captives. Let me also mention, I mentioned just as we came to the conclusion of the first hour, that here at Point of View, we have written about the millennial generation before. And there is an article, actually a series of articles in our magazine, Outlook, that we wrote a number of years ago about the millennial generation and reaching the millennial generation and some of the attributes of the born-again millennials. And if you'd like to get a free copy of the magazine, it's an older edition, but all the facts and figures are still available, and we would certainly encourage you just to contact us here at Point of View. Say, I'd like to get a copy of that magazine on millennials and how to reach them. We'd be glad to make that available to you. I'll probably mention it later in the week, but I did want to also add that as a resource from Point of View. And of course, we've already encouraged you to go to probe.org to find some of those articles, books, as well as to find out more about Once Captive. So those are some topics that are left over from the last hour. We're going to focus now on a difficult but a very important topic, and that is a new book out, The Controlling Husband. It is written by Dr. Ron Welch, and he has his doctorate from Central Michigan University, serves on the faculty of Denver Seminary, has had more than 20 years of experience in clinical psychology, with especially focusing on the issue of men with narcissistic and antisocial personalities. He has been a professor in the past at Colorado Christian University and is, in some respects, a fellow traveler as we talk about these issues. So, Dr. Ron Welch, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Pleasure to be here, Kerby. Thank you.
I sort of alluded to the obvious, and anybody that picks up your book, first of all, has the comments from your wife, Jan Welch, in the introduction, and then the really honest assessment of yourself. So I'd love to hear a little bit of your own story, because it is key to understanding some of the things that you address here in the book.
You know, one of the things I discovered is that it is really easy in today's society to focus on what you need and trying to meet your needs and do what you want to do. And society is more than happy to reinforce that. And I think a lot of things Steve was saying last hour, actually, I was thinking about some of his comments on the millennial generation, are very relevant to this idea that it's all about me. And what I see in marriage, and I saw in myself, was I was basically just kind of doing what I thought I needed to do to lead the family and take care of things. And I kind of grew up as a little bit of an insecure person. I worried about things a lot. My mom, God bless her, kind of, the glass wasn't just half empty, it was leaking slowly, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So she taught me to look for a lot of things that might be danger ahead and to watch out for those. And the difficulty was I started simply just doing that for my wife. I started things like, here's an example. I would say, where do you want to go to dinner, sweetheart? I wasn't really asking where she wanted to go to dinner. I wanted to start a conversation so I could tell her I wanted to have barbecue. Does that make sense?
It sure does.
It's this process where I was more interested in meeting my needs and trying to do what society says, in a sense. I mean, if you think about the societal model of marriage, there's even this starter marriage model out there now where you just kind of figure you're going to trade up to a better model after you try out the first one. And
that's amazing.
that concept was what I was just kind of stepping on her in the process.
This is a book published by Revell. We have it available on our website. We also have a link to this ministry, Transformational Marriages, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Transformational-marriage.com, but we have the link there in case you didn't have a chance to write that down, and we have information about the book, The Controlling Husband, What Every Woman Needs to Know. Dr. Ron Welch with us, and in the second chapter you talk about how I became a controlling husband. I think that's important for us to understand, because some people say, well, there are those that have always been bullies, but you don't necessarily, as far as I know about your personality, look like the kind that boss people around, but nevertheless you ended up being a controlling husband.
You know, I don't consider myself to be a particularly bad human being overall. I
Yes.
tried to do the right kinds of stuff, and I was taught well by my parents. My dad was a good example of how to take care of the family, but he could get angry at times, and he grew up with, you know, I watched him kind of, you know, get angry and frustrated at times, and as I said, my mom kind of worried about things and taught me to kind of think about what things might go wrong. But what ended up happening was I brought that baggage into this new relationship. And my wife came from a family where she talks about this a lot. She's very open about sharing that she came from a family where she kind of was used to being told what to do in some ways. Mm-hmm. And so what happened is it felt pretty darn comfortable. And she admits now, looking back, she's like, man, I told you what you were doing, but I didn't necessarily draw a line in the sand and say, this needs to change. So there was maybe an explanation that she wasn't feeling that her voice was being heard, and at the same time, I wasn't listening. I was too worried about trying to win the argument or trying to, you know, I wasn't into agreeing to disagree back then. I was, you know, I'm still, it's not like this is different, Kerby. It's an everyday battle. You try to constantly be aware of, what am I doing right now, and do I need to stop myself before I open my mouth and think, how is this going to honor and respect her if I say it or do it?
Very good. You know, Dr. Ron Welch with us, by the way. We're talking about a lot of issues, but one that you talk about in Chapter 4 is the alpha male problem. We sometimes talk about alpha males in dogs or gorillas or whatever, but that's an issue that you surface in terms of how it develops and how to transform it. Can you explain that, if you might?
You know, I'll be honest, I think this starts as early as the sandbox. I mean, you have Johnny's got his toy, and Frankie comes in, and Frankie wants the toy, and the battle is on. You know, it's in youth sports. I coach a lot of youth sports, and I've watched how the kids who are in control, the kids who believe they've got it covered and they've got things taken care of, do better. They're confident. You get in the work world, and bosses tell you you're supposed to be able to handle this on your own. You're supposed to take charge and be in control. I work with a lot of military folks and law enforcement, and I hear them say, I'm ordering people around during the day, and I don't know how to come home at 5 o'clock off the military base and say, sweetheart, what would you like me to do? It's a difficult transition, and I think to some degree there is a message that men are getting throughout their time growing up that says, hey, if you're in charge, you got things covered. And the problem with that I found for me, it wasn't just that I wasn't trusting my wife, I wasn't trusting God at all either. So I kind of assumed I'd send him the emails, and he would, get those and follow them, and he would have his own plan, as we all know.
Wow, incredible. Talking with Dr. Ron Welch, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about not only this problem, but the solution, because after all, we need a transformational marriage, and that is certainly one of the themes of the work that he has done, but we certainly want to also identify some of those issues, and if this connects with you at all, perhaps you've said, oh, this is exactly what I wanted to know more about, you can join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Subtitle of the book is What Every Woman Needs to Know, The Controlling Husband. It's published by Revell. Look for it in your local bookstore. That is a division of Baker Publishing, and you probably could find it in your bookstore, but in case you cannot, we also have a link to it on our website, and we also have a link to Transformational Marriage, so that any way that you can get a copy of this book, we want to make that as easy as possible. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about the problem, but also the solution, and if you'd like to join the conversation, perhaps this connects up with your experience, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Ron Welch right after this.
Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
You know, this coming election and future elections will be influenced by the millennials who view the world differently than previous generations. A higher percentage of them have college degrees than previous generations, and because of that, they are carrying heavier college loan debt than previous generations. They're also living with their parents in higher numbers because they're often struggling to find good jobs. Now, if you knew just these few facts, you might conclude that they would favor a free market over greater governmental intervention in the economy. Less government regulation and a freer market would translate into more jobs in the private sector. That is the conclusion you might also draw from the recent headlines touting a Reason Group survey of millennials. A typical headline concludes 64% of millennials favor a free market over a government-controlled economy. But if you look a little closer, you won't find as much support for capitalism. By a narrow margin, 52% favor capitalism and 42% choose socialism. The problem appears to be a lack of education about basic economic philosophies. A CBS New York Times poll from a number of years ago discovered that Americans in general had a difficult time defining the word socialism. And of all the groups surveyed, only 16% of the millennials could define socialism as a government ownership or some variation. To put that in perspective, 57% of people who self-identified themselves as part of the Tea Party gave an adequate definition of socialism. Millennials are also divided in whether free markets promote economic growth and development. Only a third believe that a free market is the most effective way in promoting economic opportunity. So educating millennials about economic philosophies is going to be key in this and future elections. If they don't know what socialism is and they don't know the benefits of a free market, they're unlikely to vote for candidates that will improve the economy, which will give them better jobs. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Ron Welch. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Might get to some of those phone calls in just a minute as we talk about his book, The Controlling Husband, What Every Woman Needs to Know. It is a book of about 200 pages that is published by Revell. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we have links to help you find it as well. And just before we take some phone calls, we might talk about that chapter, especially that you talk about strategies husbands use to control their wives, because one of the things, Ron, that I have found is that people being abused oftentimes do not know they're being abused, whether it's verbal abuse, whether it's a program we did recently on domestic abuse. Sometimes they don't see that, and you go through some of the strategies that are used, maybe not by you, but by some men to control their wives. Explain if you might.
Well, for instance, and by the way, I won't at all deny that I had some skill sets in some of these areas as well. But one of the things that happens is there are a variety of ways that men can get their way and kind of still tell themselves they're not being abusive. So I could raise my voice, and I've had couples come in that I've worked with and have said that may be the first step to trying to change their relationship is just stopping the yelling in the household. That the minute there's a conflict, there's a raising of the voice or there's a talking over. One of the things that's a real clear sign that is happening is a lot of times husbands who are controlling won't let their wives finish their sentences. And, well, this happens in society anyway, Kerby. I mean, we've all seen where we're thinking about how we want to respond to the person before we've even finished listening to them. But in these kind of marriages, it's an example of things like sports, for instance. You can have people who enjoy sports, But there are controlling husbands where if their team doesn't win on Sunday, everybody's miserable in the family all week.
Wow.
Or I've watched Saturdays be totally destroyed by parents traipsing all over the country to take their kids to 4 or 5 different soccer games, and they can't find time to have a meal together as a family, but they can go to 5 sports activities a day. So some of these things are not necessarily abusive behaviors. They may be like paranoid individuals can be very jealous. Some guys use the silent treatment to refuse to talk. Other guys can pout and just, that look when it's sort of like, I'm not happy, so I'm going to make sure you're not happy, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those strategies are there, but I don't think they're often confronted at times, partly because the wives tell me they really don't want to rock the boat and cause further problems.
I understand that. Just a minute, I want to talk about some of the principles of a transformational marriage, praise and hope and forgiveness and selflessness. But before we do so, let's take a phone call that kind of maybe will set the scene here. And we'll go to Leon in South Carolina. Thank you for calling today. You're on with Dr. Ron Welch.
How you doing, Dr. Welch?
I'm doing great. Thanks for calling.
What about the reverse situation? I'm married to someone who's a minister and a military officer, and we had a situation where she just kept going on, and I just said, the next day, we need to separate. I said, it's not about divorce. I just need to learn how to deal.
Mm-hmm.
And once I did that, it looked like she just got totally upset and sent me a letter through a law firm saying, after a year, she'd be seeking divorce. And I told her on the onset, this is not about divorce. This is about me learning how to deal.
Mm-hmm.
Any suggestions you might have, Ron?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry that led to a separation or drawing you farther apart. I certainly believe this happens in relationships regardless of the gender of the person in the marriage. But the reason we wrote the book to the controlling husband is it seems to be much more prevalent with men than women. Doesn't mean it can't happen in either direction, so I certainly understand that. I think my response to you would be, it is important to set boundaries and say these are the things that we think would need to change, but we don't want that to necessarily be an ultimatum saying if you're not perfect today, then we're done. And if my wife had done that, people have asked my wife and said, why didn't you just leave him? He was being a jerk. Why didn't you just leave him? And her response is, I saw the things God had made in him that made him possibly the person he could become sometime down the road. And I didn't want to give up on him any more than he had given up on himself. And I hope that you are able to see that setting a boundary isn't a bad thing by itself. It's just that sometimes both people have to agree to work on the marriage.
Might mention we're going to have Henry Cloud on, and he's been someone I've known since he was in undergraduate school at SMU, so we'll be talking about some of those boundaries in the future. But let's, if we can, I do want to give a few positives, and the 4 principles you talk about in the latter chapters of your book, praise, hope, forgiveness, and selflessness. Those are things that, no matter where your marriage is, are things we should work on, and talk about the importance of praising one another.
The other thing about those 4 things is they're also principles that our marital model that we have from the biblical teaching is still the best thing going. There's no one else that has a better model they're offering that's an alternative. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons that we wrote the book the way we did is we really wanted to speak to people even far beyond the church to be able to say, regardless of what you believe right now, these biblical principles build people up. They bring people closer together. They grow people closer to God and to be empowering each other to be the kind of people that God would want them to be. And one of those, for instance, is praise, because if you're constantly criticizing each other, there's research out there we've seen for many years that if you make a negative comment, it takes 5 to 7 positive things to make up for that. So I will have husbands that come in and talk about, and their wives will say, well, he criticized me for these 3 things, and I say, man, it's 7:30. You got not a lot of time left to come up with 21 positives to tell her here. Because it just, we remember all of those negative things. They break us down, and in some couples that criticism becomes really resentment and bitterness. And so if you have that kind of thing, if you have one of the primary reasons for the book, Kerby, was this idea of hope, giving them the idea that it doesn't have to be this way. And I hope the women listening understand that even with Leon, things don't have to necessarily be that way. It always takes 2 people to participate, but the thing that's required is forgiveness. And I know that for me, my wife had a lot to forgive, and frankly, she's had a lot more to forgive in this marriage than I have. And if she wasn't capable of that, it's hard to move forward, because I know some wives I talk to are just waiting for him to be that guy. They already know he's that guy. And even if he tries to change, they're just waiting for him to go back to who he was and not be able to develop that selflessness and service kind of attitude where he's serving his wife rather than trying to control her.
You talked about praise, you talked about hope and forgiving. When others serving each other, there is just kind of a servant's heart, and you have dealt over the years with men and probably women, but certainly we'll talk about men for just a minute, with sort of this narcissistic, almost antisocial personality. It's all about me. And the moment you turn that around and say, what can I do to serve you, that changes the dynamic in any marriage or any relationship, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I worked for 7 years in the federal prison system with a lot of very hard inmates who had spent a lot of time not really worrying about a moral code, but basically figuring out, if I do this, what kind of trouble am I going to get in, and more just a behavior modification mindset. And one of the things I learned is that someone who's antisocial and says, I really want to hurt this person, I enjoy it, tends to be more the people you described earlier in the violent relationships where they're really hurtful. Someone who maybe has a faith basis that says, hey, this is not who I want to be, and I find myself doing this and thinking about myself all the time, is a more selfish person. They're thinking about themselves. But a narcissist is, the way I describe it is, it's more like a scared little boy underneath who's afraid of things not going well, so they got to tell everybody else how great things are. And it's just, it's somewhat easier to help that person see if they have a faith of some sort that says, hey, this is not consistent. After a while, if you say, I believe this, and you're acting in this way toward the people you love, one or the other has to give. You can't keep having that inconsistency in your life.
Let's encourage people to go to your website, transformational-marriage.com. We have a link there, and also you have the 4 principles there: hope, forgiveness, selflessness, and praise. And it is a great resource for people to know a little bit more, not only about how to deal with a controlling spouse, but also how to build positive things in their marriage. So talk about some of the resources that are indeed available to any of our listeners there at your website.
One of the things that we've started doing is my wife has joined me in sharing some of our story, because she has a very unique perspective, understanding what the relationship was like from her perspective. And I think it really helps to hear her describe in some of the seminars we do and things we can do for churches that give you both sides of the story to say, how did this occur and how can we prevent that? I know one of the things that happened for me was I saw my 2 sons starting to talk to my wife like I did. And I gave them the father lecture, right? Well, you need to show your mother respect and all that. And then God just slapped me across the face one day and said, who do you think they're learning that from, Ron? And the website and the resources we have are meant to offer opportunities and hope for people to say, we don't have to just settle for the status quo. It doesn't have to be this way.
Very, very good. Great resources, and I hope we can maybe chat with you again, but I wanted to at least expose people to the fact that book is out, The Controlling Husband by Dr. Ron Welch, Transformational Marriage, and that is available also on our website. We have some links there, and I would encourage you to find out a little bit more. And if this describes you, of the relationship you're in, or maybe somebody that you know, I hope you'll take the time to pass some of this information on to them and apply it. So Dr. Ron Welch, it's been great to have you on the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, sir. It's been a pleasure.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, a couple of issues in the news today that we think need to be addressed, and not the least of which is a decision that came down from an appeals court that could put a dagger right in the middle of Obamacare. We'll talk about what that means right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, open line 1-800-351-1212. First hour today, we spent some time talking about the millennial generation. And again, let me offer to you a free copy of our Outlook magazine from actually 3 years ago, in which we wrote about, first of all, the millennial generation, how to reach them, and then a separate section on born-again millennials, which gives you a little bit of the summary of some of the things we talked about with Steve Cable. If you go to our website, you will see that we have a link so that you can get his book, Cultural Captives. We also have a link to Once Captive, the idea of being able to free people from cultural captivity. And that web link and the Probe Ministries web link is there. You might want to consider starting off with a assessment. It is a church assessment. Individuals in your church get a code. They can take it anonymously, but at the end, you will be surprised, I think, those of you that are in church leadership, what some of the individuals sitting in the pews actually think. And I was struck by something I mentioned earlier today, that George Barna found that when it comes to churches doing measurements, they are really pretty good at that. Churches, for example, I think you could talk to any pastor, any Bible study leader, and say, how many were in church Sunday? How many were in your Sunday school class Sunday? And they'd be able to give you an answer. I bet every pastor could tell you how many people were in church on Sunday. You could ask them, how much did you bring in through the offering? They could probably tell you to the dollar, or if not, they could find out very quickly. But you ask them, where are your people spiritually? And given the fact that churches want to measure almost everything, they haven't done, I think, as good a job of measuring spiritual maturity, of measuring what they actually believe. And so our church assessment sometimes is a wake-up call for pastors who thought that it was actually not such a problem. And I found that oftentimes pastors are a little bit like parents that send their kids to school. You can talk to almost any parent in America and say, do you think we have a problem in the school system in America? And they go, oh, yes, we do. But my own school, where my kids go, that's really a pretty good school. No, public education, it's really in a bad way. But, where my kid goes, it's really pretty good. Pastors tend to be the same way. Do you think we have spiritual decline in America? Oh, certainly we do. But I think my church is doing pretty well. Well, again, this church assessment is one way to maybe measure that. So certainly I want to encourage you to find out a little bit more. And like I said, we are still making available, and we'll maybe over the next day or two make available the Outlook magazine from a number of years ago, Reaching the Millennial Generation. If you'd like to get a copy, we'd be glad to send it to you. Okay, lots of issues in the news, and front and center was the decision that came down today from a federal appeals court that the government could not subsidize the health care premiums for people that are in areas where there is no state exchange. There's about 36 states that use the federal insurance exchange rather than a state exchange for the Affordable Care Act, oftentimes referred to as Obamacare. Now, it's a 2-to-1 decision, and already the Obama administration has said that they want to appeal it, and they want to appeal it to the entire court, which is called en banc. So right now, this was just 3 judges that looked at it. Now the entire 11 judges will look at it. Given the fact that 7 of those 11 were appointed by either President Barack Obama, 4 of those were, or then another 3 were appointed by Bill Clinton, it's possible that those 7 would actually rule that that is not unconstitutional, and that would then set up a decision, an appeal that would go to the Supreme Court. But here's the issue. There have been a lot of people that have been trying to make this a case of where the law was ambiguous. It's not ambiguous. It was intentional. And here's the issue. When the debate was taking place on the Affordable Care Act, oftentimes referred to as Obamacare, there was really an attempt on the part of those who were pushing it through, and that would be President Barack Obama, that would be the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and that would be back then the Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, to try to keep the cost down. And so this is why back then, when there was a push of Obamacare through first the House, then the Senate, to actually underestimate and lower the cost so that it would be more palatable. The way they did that, number one, was to actually force the states to take on Medicaid and other requirements, and number two, to, in a sense, push a lot of the expense onto the states, which would then have those state exchanges. I think if you were to ask somebody back then, how many of these states do you think will have state exchanges? I think the answer would have been, well, I expect all 50 states to have them. Well, that didn't quite turn out that way. You got about 36 states that where the governors looked at this and said, we're not going to take on all these expenses. You're going to break the budget. You know, at least the federal government has the ability to print money. We don't. We try to balance our budgets, and actually 49 out of the 50 states have a state constitutional requirement to balance their budgets. So they recognize very quickly what a disaster this would be. And so as a result, you have a number of these states that do not have a state exchange for the Affordable Care Act. Got it. Well, then that's the problem, because in the law, it does not allow for subsidies to be available for those particular entities, because the law plainly states, this comes from the decision today, that subsidies available only on exchanges established by states. We have 36 states that don't. Like I said, if this were to stand, it would be like a dagger into the heart of Obamacare. I mean, it just simply would not exist, because these subsidized issues are important for people to go on to the Obamacare platform in the first place. And of course, you have a majority, 36 essentially out of 50, that do not have that. And so the ruling from the court, and it was a 2-1 ruling, really should be 3-0 if you had people that actually believed in the law at all, would have to say that, wait a minute, the law does not authorize the Internal Revenue Service to provide tax credits for insurance purchased on federal exchanges. That comes directly from the decision. And it's very clear. I mean, you can read your way through the 2,700 pages of the Affordable Care Act, and I have a digital copy of it and cannot claim to have read all of it, but I've had people in this studio, people like Michael Burgess and Louis Gohmert and others, that have read every word of it, and you can see that the law, as the court ruled today, plainly does not make subsidies available. It's only available for those individuals that actually go on to the Affordable Care Act through the state subsidies. So that's where we find ourselves right now. And in case some people thought this was going to catch them off guard, I found this on National Review, and it was actually from a few days ago. And it's where this individual was writing about President Barack Obama's old Harvard law professor, Professor Lawrence Tribe at Harvard University, said that, quote, he wouldn't bet the family farm, unquote, on Obamacare surviving the legal challenge to an IRS rule about who is eligible for subsidies that are currently working their way through the federal courts. Matter of fact, he said to Fiscal Times, that is Lawrence Tribe, the Harvard law professor who was the professor for Barack Obama, he says, I don't have a crystal ball, but I wouldn't bet the family farm on this coming out in a way that preserves Obamacare. And so this is one of the latest kind of legal problems that has surfaced, and is one of the reasons why more and more people are saying that unless you bring about some remarkable change, this could spell the end of Obamacare as we know it. Now, there are solutions that I'm sure the administration has come up with. The first one, of course, is to appeal this. So they're now going to go to the 11 justices and the district court, the D.C. court, and maybe 7 of those 11 who were appointed either by Bill Clinton or Barack Obama will rule the other way. They only, of course, need 6 out of the 11. So if indeed those 7 just simply vote along partisan lines, then that would keep this going a little bit longer. If, however, at least 1 or 2 of those individuals have some kind of conscience and say, wait a minute, if we're going to take law seriously here, we really have to begin to ask ourselves the question, is there anything in the law that would allow the IRS to do that? And the answer to that is no. Well, then it goes to the Supreme Court, and then I come back to this National Review article in which they begin to estimate, what would happen. And the question is, given the fact that it was Justice Roberts who last time saved Obamacare, would he save it again? And they make a very compelling case that he probably would not, because some of the most recent rulings that Justice Roberts have signed on to, one in particular having to do with the EPA, all have to do with whether or not you actually believe the law, enforce the law, and whether or not you can go outside the law. And, of course, there are some very interesting opinions. One came from Justice Scalia, which simply said that you do not have the power to revise clear statutory terms just to try to make something work. So we have an interesting constitutional issue before us, and we'll take your phone calls right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Let's open up the phones if you'd like to join us. We've talked about a number of things, from millennials to controlling husbands to, of course, this issue of the Affordable Care Act. And I'll get into a couple other issues in just a minute, but let's give some of you a chance to join our conversation today. Let's start out in Missouri, KTTK. Ray, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I've been in my car driving and listening to the speaker, and I believe, unless this is a different radio show, it sounded a little different when I turned my radio back on. But he's talking about Once Captive. Is that the book?
That was in the first hour. Certainly, that is a relevant conversation. So what would you like to ask? Yes.
Well, I don't know why my radio is broadcasting that now, currently in the car, but I may have a different channel I have on. Just a question. When the statement is made that I've heard on the air,
lost their faith. I'm very puzzled by that statement, because for me, what I think of that is a religion like Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism, or I consider that a faith, whereas we're talking about Christianity, and that I think it was 1 or 2% of people from 18 to 40, which are actually all my kids are within that age range. So, of course, I'm very attuned to what he's saying. But my question is, why do we use that expression, or why am I hearing? I don't use the expression. But I think the second thing is, I hear all of the good things that are being done, and I think they are good things. But the concern that I have as a grandmother and as a mother, that these things are not coming out of the home. They're coming from an extra place. And my concern is that the home is not where the things are being taught, and therefore,
very true.
We're looking to external things for our kids, and I think that is right at the heart of the problem. We are not taking our homes and utilizing them. And so, to me, to go back, and I've had lots of different experiences in life, and actually we're working on, not we are, but our kids are working on the 20th grandchild, and some of our kids haven't had children yet. So young people are very much a part of my thinking, because I have a 20-year-old who's in college. So there's just a lot of issues here that, to me, I appreciate what this man is doing, but why are we not focusing on getting back into the home, even the radio shows and so forth? So my major question really is this thing about faith. Losing their faith, if they're born again, why are we talking about them losing their faith? What is it they're losing, either in college or out of it? As he pointed out, it's both arenas now are quote, losing their faith.
Sure. And let me try to address that. The first issue is, like I said, the only people that could take the survey that was done by Pro Ministries and the Barna Group were those who could answer two questions that seem to indicate that they're born again. Now, again, we can question whether they are, but they at least said that they'd had a born-again experience that was meaningful in their life, still meaningful to them today, and believe that they were saved by grace. That's a pretty good estimate. Only God can separate sheep and goats, but those certainly are the case. And so, like I said, you start with that group. Then, as soon as you begin to ask just 6 questions about a Christian worldview, these are questions that are used all the time by George Barna, and they are things like God, absolute truth, the existence of Satan, salvation, things like that. Immediately, that percentage from 100% goes down to 28%. Then when you begin to ask those individuals, do they practice their Christianity on a regular basis, to attend church 2 out of every 4 weeks, they go, they pray every day, those kind of things, it drops down from 28% to 14%. Then when you begin to ask those about other questions about their view about science or abortion, homosexuality, you're down to 2%. Now, does that mean that the 98% have lost their faith in the sense that they aren't Christians? Well, I would say that they may still be saved in their heart, but they're not thinking biblically or acting biblically as Christians should. Now, we can have a long theological debate about whether they've lost their faith or whether they were Christians in the first place, but those numbers, I think, help us understand what we're talking about. And they're not living their faith in a dynamic way that honors the Lord and follows biblical principles. Now, does that mean that they've lost their salvation? I don't think so, although I have listeners that would call in and say that they would agree with that. So that's, I think, what I'm trying to communicate. But back to your second point is very important. And that is, we found in that survey with George Barna's research that the primary influencer, the most significant influencer in the life of these individuals, whether they were teenagers or young adults, were the parents and the grandparents. Further down the list, much less significant, were the youth pastors. And I think, Ray, sometimes we are dependent upon the church to disciple our kids, and that's not what God has told us to do. But this survey once again illustrated that parents who say, well, I don't know what to do with them, so I'm going to drop them off at church and hopefully they'll get them whipped into shape and they'll teach them biblical principles. No, it has to happen in the home, and that's why we have church-oriented structures so that those ideas can be reinforced each day in the home. You can be reading those chapters, receiving an email or a voicemail, watching videos and other things, because we are convinced, just as you said, that that's where the dynamic change is going to take place. And with the falling apart of the homes, the disintegration of the families, that's one of the reasons why we're addressing these issues today. So I appreciate you calling in. You're asking really good questions, and that's why, in many cases, this Once Captive program was developed to try to address those in the core issues that need to be addressed.
Thank you.
I appreciate your call. It's a really good question, and it's a reminder that we as parents certainly need to do what we can to educate our children. God is going to hold us responsible for what we do in the homes, but at the same time, we want to provide some resources for those of you that are in church ministry, parachurch ministry. If you're a leader in a Christian church, if you're a leader in a Christian ministry, if you're a Bible study teacher, if you're a pastor, we certainly want to provide you with some of those resources. So let me mention those one more time just before we run out of time. We'll take some more phone calls tomorrow because there's more to talk about, and we'll probably know a little bit more about this court case that came down on the issue of the Affordable Care Act. So let me first of all mention that if you're interested in the book, Cultural Captives, it is, I think, an outstanding resource, which in 200 pages really pulls together all these different surveys. This is important to recognize because there are so many different surveys that have actually been done. You have the National Study of Youth and Religion. Those are the studies done by Christian Smith at Notre Dame. You have a survey of religion that was done at Baylor. You have, of course, the Barna surveys we've mentioned. And then, of course, you have these national surveys, the GSS, which are called the General Social Surveys. And lots of times people have come away saying, well, who do I trust? I mean, some seem to say one thing, some seem to say something else. And I think Steve Cable's done a very good job of pulling that together and helping us understand when you do an apples-to-apples comparison, we see some of the same trends that we've talked about in this program before with Steve Cable today, with John Dickerson in the past, with George Barna, all sorts of individuals, and that we should be very concerned about the spiritual direction in America. So that book, Cultural Captives, is available. We also have his article examining our cultural captivity, and it's available on our website as well as web links to oncecaptive.com and probe.org. Also, in this last hour, we've spent a little bit of time talking about an issue I wanted to at least alert you to, this new book out called The Controlling Husband. And so many times we're concerned about what is happening in the home. This is a book that we wanted you to know more about by Dr. Ron Welch. We have information about the book and also a link to his book, Transformational Marriage. And so we certainly encourage you to take the time to find out a little bit more about some of these resources. We have them available at our website, pointofview.net. And we certainly do want to encourage you to join our conversation every single day. And tomorrow we're going to spend some time talking about this new book with Walker Moore. He'll be in studio, Escape the Lie. And it's a book that I think will really challenge you to reevaluate some of the deception that a lot of us have adopted in our lives. So we'll spend some time talking with him. And then we'll also spend a little bit of time talking with Professor Joyce Malcolm on the whole issue of gun control. That's been in the issue for some time. And so we're going to spend some time talking with Joyce Malcolm by phone. And so I hope that you will join us every single day here on Point of View. One last time, the website is pointofview.net. We have the livecast there. You can watch the podcast or the livecast after the program is over. And we encourage you maybe to take the time to educate others. And if you like what you see there, you can hit that share button and post it on your own blog or Facebook page or something of that nature. And so we hope that you'll always visit the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris for their help behind the scenes. We'll hope you join us tomorrow on Point of View. We'll see you back then.
You have been listening to Point of View. For materials offered on the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.